My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I never thought my own father would uninvite me to Christmas because I didn't fit the image he wanted to show off. When that text came through 3 days before the holiday, my hands went numb and my chest tightened like someone had squeezed all the air out of my lungs. He said it so casually, like he was just rearranging a seating chart instead of erasing his daughter from the family gathering. The worst part wasn't the exclusion itself. It was realizing that to him, I was an inconvenience, a potential embarrassment in front of people who mattered more than I ever would. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because I have a feeling some of you know exactly what this kind of betrayal feels like. You won't believe what I did next, and honestly, looking back, I'm still surprised I had the courage to go through with it. Most people would have cried, begged for an explanation, or cut ties completely and spent Christmas alone with a bottle of wine and a pile of regrets. But something inside me shifted that day, a quiet, burning resolve that whispered, "Don't argue, don't plead, just show up and let them see exactly what they tried to hide." I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of breaking me, and I definitely wasn't going to let my silence be mistaken for acceptance. So here's the thing about being excluded from your own family's Christmas celebration. My father uninvited me from Christmas because I didn't fit his image, but I showed up anyway, and what happened next left everyone speechless. What started as the most painful rejection I'd ever experienced turned into the moment I reclaimed every ounce of dignity they thought they could take from me. The look on their faces when I walked through that door, the shift in energy when the so-called important guests actually enjoyed my company, and the silent humiliation my father felt when his plan backfired. It was better than any revenge I could have plotted. If you've ever been made to feel like you're not good enough for the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, stay with me, because this story is about to get real. I thought being uninvited to Christmas would hurt less than the truth behind it, but I was wrong. So incredibly, devastatingly wrong. When my phone buzzed that Tuesday afternoon and I saw my father's name on the screen, I expected the usual. A reminder about what dish to bring, maybe a question about my arrival time, something normal that families do before the holidays. Instead, I got a carefully worded text that felt like a knife sliding between my ribs, cold and precise, designed to cut deep without leaving visible scars. He didn't even have the decency to call me, to hear my voice crack or give me a chance to respond in real time. He just typed out his decision like he was canceling a dinner reservation. The message said my sister Stephanie's in-laws would be joining us this year, and since they were distinguished people with certain expectations, it would be better if I sat this one out. Better for whom? I wondered as my vision blurred, and the words on the screen started to swim together. He actually used the phrase family optics, like we were a corporation managing a brand instead of people who'd shared birthdays, holidays, and supposedly unconditional love for 3 decades. I read it 5 times, hoping I'd misunderstood, hoping there was some hidden meaning I was missing, but the truth was brutally clear. I was an embarrassment, a liability, something to be hidden away when the right people were watching. One text message changed how I saw my family forever, stripping away every comforting illusion I'd built about where I stood in their lives. Before I tell you what happened next, hit that subscribe button if you're already invested in this story, and drop a like if you've ever felt like you weren't good enough for the people who should have loved you most, because what comes next is going to show you exactly how I handled it. I stared at that message for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, my mind racing through every family dinner, every holiday photo, every moment I'd convinced myself that despite our differences, blood meant something. And then I realized the most painful truth of all. This wasn't the first time I'd been minimized, sidelined, or made to feel like I needed to shrink myself to fit their narrative. It was just the first time they'd been bold enough to say it out loud. My father said it was for the best that I didn't come, as if he was doing me some kind of favor, as if sparing me from a gathering I'd been looking forward to for months was an act of kindness instead of rejection. I replayed that conversation in my head 1,000 times over the next few hours, dissecting every word, every implication, trying to understand when exactly I'd become someone my own father was ashamed of. He followed up his initial text with a phone call, and his voice had that patronizing tone he'd perfected over the years. the one that suggested he was protecting me from something, that he had my best interests at heart, when really he was just making excuses for his own cowardice. Apparently, I wasn't the right image for important people, and that's what destroyed me more than anything else. It wasn't about money or credentials or fitting into some narrow definition of success. It was about how I carried myself, how I didn't apologize for my opinions, how I'd built a life that was authentically mine instead of one designed to please the people around me. My father had always been about appearances, about what the neighbors thought, about maintaining a certain status in our small town social hierarchy. But I'd thought that with his own daughter, with blood and history and countless memories between us, he'd see past all that superficial garbage and just love me for who I was. That was the moment silence became my strategy. The exact second I decided that fighting, explaining, or trying to convince him of my worth would only waste energy I needed to protect myself. I hung up the phone after his call ended. He did most of the talking anyway. And I didn't argue, didn't cry in front of him, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing how much he'd hurt me. Instead, I went quiet. So quiet that the silence seemed to have its own weight, its own power. I realized in that stillness that I'd spent my entire life trying to earn approval from people who'd already made up their minds about me, and that realization felt like waking up from a long, exhausting dream where nothing I did was ever quite good enough. He mentioned my sister's in-laws with this weird reverence in his voice, like he was talking about royalty or celebrities instead of just regular people who happened to have money and connections. According to him, they were educated, wealthy, respected, which I guess was code for not like Emily, who's too independent and doesn't know how to stay in her lane. The way he described them made my stomach twist because I realized he'd never used those kinds of words to describe me, his own daughter, even though I'd graduated top of my class and built a career I was proud of without needing his help or validation. It was like he'd been comparing me to some invisible standard my entire life, and I'd always fallen short. And now, with his in-laws coming, he finally had the excuse he needed to make it official. Then he implied I might embarrass them just by existing. Those weren't his exact words, but that was the message underneath every careful phrase he used. He said things like, "You know how you can be, and you're not always great with certain types of people," which was rich coming from the man who taught me to speak my mind and stand up for what I believed in, right up until the moment those beliefs became inconvenient for him. I thought about every dinner party I'd attended, every interaction I'd had with extended family and family friends, trying to remember if I'd done something so catastrophically wrong that I deserved to be completely erased from a holiday gathering. The answer was no. The real problem was that I was too much for him to control, too visible, too much myself. I realized status mattered more than blood, and that understanding hit me like a physical blow that knocked the wind out of my lungs. If you've felt that same realization, where you suddenly see your place in your family's priorities laid bare, and it's nowhere near where you thought it was, then you know exactly how I felt in that moment. Raw, exposed, angry in a way that went deeper than tears. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed because this is about to get so much heavier. And leave a like if you think what my father did was completely out of line. What was supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year became the moment I had to face the truth that the people I loved most didn't actually see me. They just saw an image they couldn't control, a variable in their carefully curated life that threatened to mess everything up. This wasn't the first time I was minimized for comfort. And that's what made the Christmas exclusion feel less like a single betrayal, and more like the final confirmation of a pattern I'd been refusing to see clearly for years. I started thinking back through my childhood and teenage years, remembering all the small moments when my confidence was treated like a problem that needed fixing, when my accomplishments were met with, "That's nice, but," followed by something about how I should be more careful not to intimidate people or make others feel bad about themselves. My mother used to say things like, "Emily, you're so bright, but you need to learn to dim your light a little bit so other people don't feel so insecure around you," which basically taught me that my existence was responsible for other people's feelings of inadequacy. I had always been the inconvenient success, the daughter who didn't need rescuing, who didn't play the helpless game that seemed to make my parents feel needed and important. While my sister Stephanie had gotten married at 23 to a man our parents approved of, settled into the traditional role they'd always wanted for their daughters. I'd gone to college on a scholarship, built a career in marketing that actually paid well, and made the choice to stay single because I wasn't itching to rush into a relationship just to check a box. My parents treated my independence like it was a personal rejection of their values, a rebellion against the family legacy, when really I was just trying to live authentically. Every achievement I reached became somehow threatening to them, like my success reflected poorly on their parenting, because it didn't look exactly like the blueprint they'd drawn up. Independent, outspoken, and hard to hide. That was the unofficial description of me and our family, delivered with a mixture of pride and resentment that never quite balanced out. I was the one who asked uncomfortable questions at family dinners, who didn't pretend to agree with opinions I found backward or harmful, who refused to participate in the little social games that kept everyone comfortable and compliant. My father had always said he appreciated that about me when I was younger, back when my feistiness seemed charming and precocious. But somewhere along the way, it became an embarrassment, something to be managed instead of celebrated. The person he'd encouraged me to be, strong, independent, unapologetic, was now the exact person he needed to hide when the right people were around. And that contradiction cut deeper than I could have possibly explained to anyone who hadn't lived through it. If you've ever been sidelined to protect appearances, you understand the specific kind of loneliness that comes with it. The feeling that you're only acceptable in certain contexts, with certain people, in certain carefully controlled situations. It's not like being criticized for something you've done wrong. It's so much worse because it's about who you fundamentally are, the essence of your personality, the things that make you uniquely yourself. You start to internalize the message that there's something wrong with you, something that needs to be hidden or corrected or at the very least apologized for, and over time, that message rewires your brain in ways you don't even notice until you're 32 years old, and your father is uninviting you from Christmas because you might make his important friends uncomfortable. Being erased hurts more than being criticized, and I wish someone had told me that years ago so I could have protected myself better. When someone criticizes you, at least they're acknowledging your existence, engaging with you, treating you like you matter enough to invest in changing. But erasure is a different kind of violence altogether. It says, you matter so little that the easiest solution is to just remove you from the equation entirely. And that message seeps into your bones and makes a home there. I'd spent so many years trying to be smaller, quieter, less threatening to the fragile egos of people around me. And it had never been enough, would never be enough, because the real problem wasn't my behavior. It was simply that I existed in a way that couldn't be controlled or packaged or presented to the world as acceptable. It teaches you where you truly stand, and standing there is cold and illuminating and absolutely devastating all at once. Every time I'd been excluded from a family outing, every time a comment about my dating life or my career choices had been made with that particular edge of disappointment, every time I'd been expected to apologize for saying something true but inconvenient, all of it suddenly made sense as part of a larger narrative. I wasn't the problem child who'd gone off the rails. I was simply the inconvenient truth that my family preferred to ignore, and now that truth was too big to ignore. So their solution was to pretend I didn't exist at all. That realization was brutal, but it was also clarifying in a way that nothing else had ever been. And somewhere in the rubble of that moment, something inside me started to shift and harden into something new. I didn't argue or ask for explanations, didn't send back a carefully crafted response designed to convince my father that I was worthy of inclusion, didn't do any of the things that my younger self would have done in this situation. The old Emily would have called him back immediately, would have spent hours on the phone trying to understand his perspective, would have offered to change something about herself to make the situation more palatable, but that Emily was exhausted, and I was finally ready to stop performing for people who had no interest in seeing the real me anyway. When my father texted again the next day with some half-hearted apology that somehow managed to justify his decision even while pretending to regret it, I didn't respond. I just read it, felt the familiar sting of disappointment, and then made a choice that would change everything. I stopped trying to earn a seat that wasn't offered, and that decision felt like setting down a weight I'd been carrying my entire life without even realizing how heavy it was. For 32 years, I'd been working overtime to prove that I was good enough, smart enough, worthy enough to be loved by my own family unconditionally. And it suddenly occurred to me that unconditional love shouldn't require conditions in the first place. I thought about all the energy I'd spent trying to be the daughter they wanted instead of the daughter I actually was, all the times I'd apologized for my own existence, all the ways I'd made myself smaller to fit into the space they'd allocated for me. And I thought, no more. Just like that, something inside me crystallized into clarity and determination. If you're at that same crossroads right now, where you're tired of chasing people who don't want to be caught, hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because what comes next is about reclaiming your power, and you're going to want to see how I did it. Dignity doesn't negotiate. And that became my mantra as I started planning what would come next. I realized that the most powerful thing I could do wasn't to beg or explain or try to convince anyone of my worth. It was to simply show up, to take up space unapologetically, to let my presence speak louder than any words I could possibly say. Begging for a seat at the table is exhausting and demeaning and usually futile, but walking in unannounced with your head held high, with nothing to prove and nothing to lose, is a completely different energy. My father had made his choice, and I was finally making mine, and the two decisions were about to collide in a way that would shake the foundation of everything our family thought they understood about me and themselves. While they planned a perfect image, I planned presence, and those two things turned out to be fundamentally incompatible in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, until I was deep in the middle of executing my plan. I spent the next few days not stewing in my pain or crying or doing anything dramatic. Instead, I got calm, preternaturally calm, the kind of calm that comes from finally knowing exactly what you're going to do and feeling completely at peace with the consequences. I started thinking about logistics, what time they usually ate dinner on Christmas Eve, what the family gathering would actually look like, where I might position myself, how I would make my entrance. I wasn't planning some big theatrical moment or some confrontation. I was planning something far more powerful, which was simply to exist in a space where I'd been told I didn't belong, to be undeniably present in a situation where I'd been told I would ruin everything. Not to confront, but to exist unapologetically became my entire strategy, distilled into 4 words that would guide every decision I made over the next 72 hours. I didn't want to start a fight or make accusations or put my father on the spot, because I'd learned a long time ago that confrontation with him always ended with me apologizing for hurting his feelings, for making things uncomfortable, for being the problem that needed to be managed. Instead, I would simply show up, would dress beautifully, would carry myself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from finally accepting exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it. I took time to do my hair and nails, bought a dress that made me feel powerful and beautiful and completely comfortable in my own skin, and practiced standing in front of the mirror with my shoulders back and my head held high, reminding myself that I had every right to be in that room. Truth needs no introduction, and neither did I realized as Christmas Eve morning arrived, and I felt this strange sense of calm wash over me like warm water. I wasn't nervous or scared or second-guessing myself. I was just ready, clear-eyed and centered in a way I hadn't felt in years. My plan wasn't complicated or dramatic. It was actually quite simple. I would drive to my parents' house that evening, would arrive after the initial dinner service had started, would simply walk through that door like I lived there, like I belonged there, because I did. Whatever happened after that would happen, but I knew with absolute certainty that I was doing the right thing, that showing up for myself was the most important decision I'd made in a very long time. I arrived later than expected, without announcement, pulling into my parents' driveway at around 7:30 in the evening when I knew dinner would be in full swing, and everyone would be settled and comfortable in their routines. My heart was pounding as I sat in my car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, taking deep breaths, and reminding myself of why I was doing this. Not for revenge, not to hurt anyone, but to reclaim my own power and refuse to be invisible any longer. The house was lit up beautifully, the kind of perfect Christmas card scene my mother had always obsessed over, with white lights strung across the front porch and a wreath on the door that probably cost more than my car payment. I could see shadows moving inside, hear the muffled sounds of conversation and laughter, and I thought about turning around, about driving away and sparing myself and everyone else the awkwardness of what was about to happen. But then I remembered my father's text, remembered the weight of 32 years of being made to feel like I wasn't quite good enough, and I opened that car door and stepped out into the cold December night with my chin up and my shoulders back. The room shifted before anyone spoke, and I could feel it the moment I walked through that front door. The energy changed instantly, like electricity running through the air, like everyone's radar had suddenly picked up on something unexpected and dangerous. My mother was the first one to see me, and her face went through about 5 different emotions in the span of 2 seconds. Surprise, panic, anger, confusion, and finally something that looked almost like fear, like she was watching a ghost walk into her carefully orchestrated dinner party. My father was sitting at the head of the table in his usual spot, and when he looked up and saw me, I watched the color drain from his face in a way that would have been funny if it weren't so sad. Sometimes energy reveals what words hide, and the energy in that room was screaming louder than any words could have possibly done. Nobody said anything for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, and in that silence I could feel everyone trying to process what was happening, trying to figure out if this was real or some kind of strange Christmas Eve hallucination. I could see my sister Stephanie's jaw clench, could see the way she looked at her husband like she was trying to communicate something urgent through telepathy, could see the confusion on the faces of the important guests who hadn't been warned that the family had a member they'd tried to delete from the equation. I walked calmly to the dining room, pulled out an empty chair that happened to be right in the middle of the table, sat down like I'd been expected there all along, and smiled at everyone with a sweetness that was absolutely calculated and completely genuine at the same time. The elite guests were polite, curious, not judgmental, and that was perhaps the most interesting part of the entire evening, watching how these supposedly sophisticated people reacted to my presence with genuine warmth and interest, instead of the disdain my family had warned me would come. One of them, a woman named Margaret, who was married to Stephanie's father-in-law, actually seemed delighted by my arrival, asking me questions about my work and my life with the kind of genuine interest that my own family had never quite managed. She didn't seem to care that I was outspoken or independent or any of the things my father had implied would be embarrassing. If anything, she seemed to find those qualities refreshing and engaging. The other guests followed her lead, treating me with respect and curiosity, asking me about my career in marketing and actually listening to my answers instead of nodding politely while waiting for an opportunity to talk about themselves. It wasn't them who looked uncomfortable. It was my family. And that realization was almost as satisfying as I'd hoped it would be. Maybe even more so because it was happening in real time and I got to watch it unfold. My father had barely touched his food since I arrived, just pushing it around his plate with his fork, his jaw working like he was grinding his teeth. My mother kept getting up to fuss with things in the kitchen, things that absolutely didn't need fussing with, just desperately searching for an escape from a situation she clearly hadn't anticipated. Stephanie kept shooting daggers at me with her eyes, like my mere presence at this table was somehow a personal attack on her, a betrayal of some unspoken agreement that I would stay hidden and not disrupt her perfect family image. Her husband, a guy named Robert who had never been particularly warm to me, looked absolutely mortified, like he was sitting in an episode of a reality show that had suddenly gone completely off the rails. Before we go any further, if you've ever stood your ground and watched people scramble to deal with the consequences, hit that subscribe button and leave a like, because what happens in the next part of this story is absolutely wild. The dynamic at that table had completely inverted, and everyone could feel it shifting like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface. I was calm and engaged and entirely comfortable, while the people who were supposed to be in control were visibly rattled by my refusal to play by their rules, or disappear, or apologize for existing. I engaged with Margaret and the other guests in genuine conversation, asked them real questions, listened to their answers with actual interest, instead of the performative attention my family usually offered. The more I talked, the more the uncomfortable silence from the rest of the family became almost deafening, and I could feel the weight of their embarrassment and anger and confusion pressing down on the table like a physical force. My father kept looking at my mother like he was waiting for her to do something, to handle me somehow. but neither of them had any idea what to do with a daughter who'd finally stopped trying to earn their approval. Conversations flowed when I spoke, naturally and easily, without any of the forced politeness or careful maneuvering that usually characterized family gatherings where I was present. Margaret asked me about a marketing campaign I'd recently launched, and I found myself explaining it with genuine enthusiasm, breaking down the strategy and the results in a way that clearly demonstrated expertise and creative thinking. The other guests leaned in, asking follow-up questions, genuinely interested in hearing more, and I realized in that moment that my father's fear about me embarrassing him in front of these people was completely unfounded. I wasn't the problem. I was actually adding something valuable to the conversation, bringing intelligence and perspective and authenticity to a table that had been drowning in performative pleasantness just moments before. Respect followed naturally, without credentials. And that was the real kicker, the thing that completely dismantled my father's entire justification for uninviting me in the first place. These people didn't care about some imaginary status hierarchy or social pecking order. They respected competence, intelligence, genuine engagement, and authenticity, all of which I had in abundance. One of the other guests, a man named David who worked in finance, started asking me questions about my marketing background, and even mentioned that his company was looking to hire someone with my skill set. The conversation was happening organically, naturally, without anyone performing or pretending or trying to manage an image, and it was everything a real human interaction should be. I could see my father watching this unfold from his position at the head of the table, could literally see the moment he realized that his worst fears weren't coming true. Instead, something far worse was happening from his perspective. His excluded daughter was thriving without his approval, was respected and valued by exactly the people he'd been so worried about impressing. Status couldn't replace substance, and that truth was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore as the evening progressed, and the real measure of a person became crystal clear to everyone at that table. My sister Stephanie had married into wealth and position, had checked all the boxes that our parents valued, and yet she was sitting there with a forced smile and tense shoulders, while I was relaxed and engaged and genuinely enjoying myself. Her husband, Robert, with all his credentials and social standing, was struggling to contribute meaningfully to conversations, while I was seamlessly connecting with people from completely different walks of life. The irony wasn't lost on me or, I suspect, on anyone else who was paying attention. The person they'd tried to hide because they were bad for the image was actually the one making the best impression, the one bringing real value and authenticity to what had been a sterile, carefully curated evening. The shame they feared wasn't me. It was their own insecurity, now visible to everyone in that room, including the guests they'd been so desperate to impress. My father had constructed this entire narrative in his head about how I would embarrass him, how my independence and outspokenness would somehow reflect poorly on him and damage his carefully maintained social standing. But what was actually happening was that his discomfort with my presence, his obvious resentment and anxiety, was far more embarrassing than anything I could have possibly done. People could see right through the facade, could sense the tension and the unspoken conflict, could feel the weight of family dynamics that were clearly unhealthy and unresolved. Margaret had even pulled me aside at one point, touching my arm gently and saying something like, "You're a breath of fresh air, Emily. Thank you for being here," which was basically her way of acknowledging that she could see the dynamics at play and where her sympathy actually lay. Pretending collapsed under honesty, and that collapse was swift and complete and absolutely irreversible. You can only maintain a false image for so long before reality starts bleeding through the cracks, and my presence at that table was essentially a crack in the facade that had grown into a fissure, then a chasm. My mother eventually excused herself and went upstairs, claiming she had a headache, which was basically her white flag of surrender. My father excused himself shortly after, muttering something about needing to check on something in the garage, which fooled absolutely no one. Stephanie and Robert sat there growing increasingly uncomfortable as the evening wore on, their perfect image of a harmonious, sophisticated family gathering completely shattered by the introduction of one inconvenient truth, that some people can't be hidden away, that authenticity eventually wins out over performance, that trying to delete someone from your life never actually works the way you hope it will. The important guests stayed longer than they probably would have if everything had gone according to my father's plan, and they actually seemed to be enjoying themselves despite the obvious family tension. Margaret and I exchanged phone numbers before they left, and she made a point of telling me that if I ever wanted to grab coffee or talk about that job opportunity her company had, I should absolutely reach out. That wasn't supposed to happen according to my father's narrative. I was supposed to be the liability, the problem, the reason the evening would be ruined. Instead, I'd made a genuine connection with people he'd been so anxious about impressing, and I'd done it by simply being myself, unapologetically and completely. The irony was almost painful in its perfection, and I watched it register on my father's face when he came back from the garage and realized what had actually transpired while he was hiding away. I felt no victory, only clarity, and that absence of triumphant emotion surprised me in a way I hadn't anticipated, but it also felt right in a way that vindictive satisfaction never could have. As I drove home that night, replaying the evening in my mind, I realized I wasn't feeling smug or superior, or even particularly satisfied with how things had unfolded. What I was feeling instead was a profound sense of peace, a lightness in my chest that had nothing to do with winning or proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with finally understanding my own power and refusing to give it away to people who didn't deserve it. The victory wasn't in showing my father up in front of his important guests. The victory was in realizing that I didn't need his approval to know my own worth, didn't need his validation to understand that I was intelligent and capable and genuinely likable to people who mattered. I didn't need their approval to belong anywhere, and that realization fundamentally restructured how I understood my place in the world and in my family. For so long, I'd internalized the belief that I was somehow defective, that there was something about me that needed fixing or hiding or apologizing for. And suddenly I could see that belief for what it actually was. A lie that had been told to me so many times and by so many people that I'd started believing it myself. But sitting at that table, engaging with people who found me valuable and interesting exactly as I was, showed me that the problem was never me. The problem was that my family had built their entire value system around appearances and status and control, and I had never fit into that system because I had never wanted to. That was their loss, not mine, and somehow that understanding made all the pain of the previous days feel almost worth it. Freedom replaced longing, settling into my bones like a temperature I'd never felt before, but immediately recognized as right and true and permanent. I stopped wishing for my father's pride, stopped hoping that one day he would just accept me as I was, stopped holding my breath waiting for my mother to stand up for me or my sister to choose our relationship over her own comfort. I let all of that go in one clean sweep, and in the space where that desperate longing had lived, something new grew, a kind of peaceful indifference that wasn't cold or cruel, but rather a mature understanding that I couldn't control other people's choices, could only control my own. I could choose to show up for myself, could choose to take up space, could choose to be unapologetically myself even when that choice made other people uncomfortable. And suddenly everything changed. Not because anyone else had transformed, but because I had fundamentally shifted how I related to their rejection and their shame and their fear of me. Sometimes exclusion is protection in disguise, and I mean that in the most literal sense possible. My father's attempt to exclude me from Christmas actually protected me from wasting more years of my life trying to please people who had already decided I wasn't worth their effort. If he had invited me, if he had welcomed me with open arms and treated me like a valued family member, I probably would have continued down that same exhausting path of trying to be smaller and quieter and more palatable, would have kept shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never designed for someone like me. His rejection, as painful as it was in the moment, forced me to confront the reality of our relationship and to stop pretending that it was something healthier than it actually was. Sometimes the people we love hurt us not because they're malicious, but because they're limited, and their limitations become our ceilings if we're not careful. Not every table deserves your presence, and understanding that is one of the most liberating realizations you can come to in your lifetime. You don't owe anyone your energy, your authenticity, your time, or your emotional labor, especially not people who've made it clear that they want you to be something other than yourself. There are tables where you're not wanted, spaces where your presence makes people uncomfortable, situations where no matter how hard you try or how much you change, you'll still be seen as a problem to be managed. And that's actually fine. More than fine. That's information you need to know so you can stop wasting your precious limited time trying to convince people to want you when there are people out there who already do, people who see your value immediately and without hesitation. My father's table wasn't worth my presence, wasn't worth my effort, wasn't worth the years of self-doubt and pain I'd invested trying to earn a place at it. And not every rejection is a loss, because some rejections are actually gifts wrapped up in painful packaging, rejections that redirect you away from situations that were slowly suffocating you and toward a life that's more aligned with who you actually are. I spent so many years interpreting my family's coldness as a reflection of my inadequacy, when really it was just a reflection of their inability to see past their own fears and insecurities. The rejection hurt, absolutely, but it also forced me to look inward and ask myself some hard questions. Who do I actually want to be? What do I actually believe? What kind of life do I want to build? And the answers to those questions had nothing to do with my father's approval or my mother's acceptance or my sister's comfort. They had everything to do with me, with my values, with the kind of woman I wanted to become, and the kind of relationships I wanted to invest in going forward. That Christmas taught me something permanent, something so fundamental that it's restructured how I move through the world and how I relate to every single person in my life going forward. I learned that you don't have to earn love from the people who claim to love you unconditionally. If you have to earn it, then it's not unconditional. It's transactional, and transactions can be revoked the moment you stop meeting the conditions. I learned that the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who see you completely, including all the parts that are difficult or inconvenient or different from what they expected, and choose you anyway. I learned that there's a specific kind of strength that comes from finally accepting that some relationships are going to be toxic, no matter how hard you try to heal them, and the bravest thing you can do is walk away with your dignity intact. My father's attempt to erase me backfired spectacularly, but more importantly, it forced me to erase the fantasy version of our relationship that I'd been clinging to for far too long. You don't prove worth by fitting in. And that's the message I want to leave you with as we approach the end of this story, because I know some of you watching are struggling with exactly this thing right now. You're trying to mold yourself into a shape that your family approves of, that your friends would celebrate, that society has told you is acceptable and valuable and right. You're diminishing your own light so that other people don't feel insecure in your presence. You're apologizing for your opinions and your ambitions and your authenticity. You're performing a version of yourself that you think will finally be good enough. And I'm here to tell you that it won't work. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because the people who need you to be small are never going to be satisfied no matter how small you make yourself. There will always be another way you're not quite right, another aspect of yourself you need to hide, another apology you need to make for simply existing. You reveal it by standing firm, by taking up space unapologetically, by refusing to negotiate your authentic self in exchange for someone else's comfort. When I walked into my parents' house that Christmas Eve without being invited, when I sat down at that table without asking for permission, when I engaged authentically with people instead of performing some carefully curated version of myself, that's when my actual value became apparent. Not because I was suddenly smarter or better than I'd been before, but because I stopped hiding who I already was. The most powerful thing you can do is simply show up as yourself, completely and unapologetically, and let people decide whether they want to be part of your life or not. Some of them won't. Some of them will walk away or become uncomfortable, or try to punish you for refusing to shrink. But that's actually information. That's clarity. That's a gift, even though it doesn't feel like one in the moment. After hearing my story, what would you have done in my place? That's the question I want to leave you with. Not because I need validation for my choices, but because I genuinely want you to sit with that question and think about what it means for your own life. Would you have shown up? Would you have fought for your place at the table? Or would you have accepted the rejection and tried to move on quietly? Would you have sought revenge? Or would you have sought clarity? There's no single right answer to those questions, but the fact that you're asking them, The fact that you're thinking about what it means to stand up for yourself and your dignity, that matters. That's the real story here. Not what happened at my parents' house on Christmas Eve, but what happens inside you when you finally decide that you're worth fighting for, even if you have to fight alone. What's your take on revenge, betrayal, and this whole situation? Do you believe that showing up uninvited was the right move? Or do you think I should have taken a different approach? Was I wrong for what I did? Or do you think my father and my family deserve to face the consequences of their rejection? Let me know in the comments, because I genuinely want to hear your perspective, want to know if this story resonates with you, want to understand how you would have handled something this painful and complicated. The comments section is where the real community happens, where we all get to learn from each other's experiences and support each other through our own versions of this same struggle. The struggle to be seen, to be valued, to be loved authentically by the people we care about most. If you want more stories like this, stories about standing up for yourself, about silent revenge through self-respect, about the complicated dynamics of family trauma and personal growth, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Don't miss the next one, where I'll share an even crazier story about the fallout from that Christmas, about how my family reacted in the weeks and months that followed, and about the unexpected way that Margaret's job offer actually changed the entire trajectory of my life. This journey didn't end on Christmas Eve. It actually intensified. It got messier and more complicated and ultimately more transformative than I ever could have anticipated. I'll see you in the next video, and thank you for letting me share this deeply personal part of my story with you. Your support, your engagement, and your willingness to be part of this community means everything to me, and I can't wait to continue this conversation with you all soon.